Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. You've seen the news, you know it's happening. Filipinos can now travel visa-free to Canada, but only if you're eligible. So in this video, we're going to have an in-depth discussion about Canada's Electronic Travel Authorization and some other really big updates about Canadian immigration. And who is the perfect person to discuss that? None other than our trusted immigration lawyer who helped Bea and myself become permanent residents of Canada, the founder of LJD Law, Lou Dangzalan. Lou, welcome back.
Hey Daniel, nice to see you, and thanks for having me again.
Yeah, for sure. You've been giving us and our viewers a lot of valuable information in the past few months, and now we've got some exciting updates. So, Lou, I know you've been on Omni News, you've been in the media, you've been talking about this for a few days now. Can you explain what Canada's Electronic Travel Authorization or ETA is?
So, in a nutshell, the ETA program is an electronic travel permit for individuals who are normally visa free to enter Canada. So, citizens and passport holders from France, from let's say from the United Kingdom, from Australia, if they wish to visit Canada, before they do so, they must secure an electronic travel authorization. So, uh, basically, this allows them to travel board their flight and travel to Canada. But in recent years, Canada's started to expand this to certain countries that would normally have required to secure a visitor visa or a temporary resident visa to come to Canada, such as citizens of Brazil and previously the citizens of Romania, for example. So as of last week, as you just hinted, uh, Immigration Canada, through the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, Sean Fraser, they made an announcement. They were going to expand this list of countries who are now eligible to apply for an electronic travel authorization to 13 more countries, and that includes the Philippines. So this is a game changer for a lot of Philippine passport holders because it is facilitative in that you don't have to apply for a temporary resident visa to fly to Canada anymore if you meet the two conditions. So you're right to say at the beginning of your introduction that it's for eligible individuals who carry a Philippine passport. And very quickly, and I've said this often, and it's been said a lot in the media, the two conditions, and it could be one or the other, if you meet one of the two, then you can apply for an electronic travel authorization. The first is if you have a valid US visa, then you can apply for an electronic travel authorization. So that means if you have a US non-immigrant visa, such as a J1 visa, cultural exchange, or a transit visa, or a student visa to enter the United States, as long as you're not permanently immigrating to the United States, then you can apply for an ETA if you have a Philippine passport. The second situation where you can apply for an ETA is if you, in the last 10 years, held a Canadian visa. Notice that I didn't say valid Canadian visa. So that means if your visa was issued to you in the last 10 years, or if you had one in the last 10 years, let's say it was issued 15 years ago, but you had a 10-year valid passport, so it only expired, let's say, 8 years ago. In that situation, you would have had a Canadian visa in the last 10 years. Therefore, you're eligible to apply for an ETA. So that's huge. That means that you don't have to submit a lot of documents, such as your banking documents, letters of invitation, proof of booking, proof of an itinerary, travel plans, a letter. It's definitely less hassle. Plus, a TRV costs $100 Canadian, whereas an ETA, you just need a credit card and you need to pay $7 Canadian and you're all set. And approval usually happens within minutes if there are no hits to your name.
That's awesome. And going to the first a valid US visa. You mentioned valid, so it can't be something that is expired. Let's say 5 years ago you had a J1 visa and now of course it's expired. So basically you're not eligible at that point.
Correct. So notice that when I said Canadian, it has to be like a Canadian visa in the last 10 years. It doesn't have to be valid, but with the US, it has to be valid. That's exactly it. So, for example, if you had a J1, as you rightly pointed out, but it already expired last year, even it's within the last 10 years, unlike the Canadian visa, in that situation, you cannot apply for an ETA. You must have a valid US visa. A lot of people, before they even get a J1 or maybe afterwards, they secure a visitor visa to the United States. In that situation, as long as there's a valid non-immigrant US visa, you're fine. You can apply for an ETA.
That's awesome. And does this include uh previous international students or, temporary workers as well? Again, even
Right.
with expired Canadian visas, that includes them?
That's a very good question. And the answer is yes. So if you studied in Canada, let's say 5 years ago, you left Canada for another country, and your Canadian visa to enter Canada to study in Canada already expired, you're still within the last 10 years, right? So in that situation, you can apply for an ETA. Same thing for foreign workers, for Filipinos who hold Philippine passports and they worked in Canada. Let's say they left 5 years ago, and their visa to enter Canada was valid in the last 10 years. Uh, then they can apply for an ETA.
Hmm, very good. And now, Lou, we're going into the juicy questions that people want to know the answers to.
Hmm.
Can you work or look for work with an ETA in Canada?
That's a good question. So, the regulations actually specifically tell you that if you're a foreign national, including Philippine citizens, as long as you're not a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, you must have the authorization to work. And that usually involves securing a work permit. And in order to secure a work permit, normally you must have a labor market impact assessment. All that to say is that you need a work permit for most cases. In certain situations, you don't need a work permit, so an ETA would be sufficient. Let me give you an example. If you're a flight attendant who works for, let's say, Philippine Airlines, you're entering Canada, you don't need a work permit to work in Canada when you're doing your job as a flight attendant for that flight between Manila and Vancouver, for example. So it's the same thing for other foreign nationals who are working for airlines as pilots, for example, who are flying to Canada. Obviously, when they fly their planes over Canada into a Canadian airport, they're working in Canada, but they actually don't need a work permit because that's part of the regulations. They are allowed to work in Canada, but those are very narrow exceptions when you don't need a work permit. But generally speaking, you do. An ETA is largely for visiting friends, family, to do tourism, for certain types of business visits, but that doesn't mean that you're allowed employment in Canada.
Got it. How about a lot of international students want to study here? Can you study in Canada with an ETA?
That's a really good question. The answer is yes. If your program of study is less than 6 months and doesn't lead to a degree or a program certificate or a diploma in Canada, you're fine. So, for example, if you're an exchange student to Canada for 1 semester, let's say you got a sweet exchange semesters exchange at the University of Toronto, and you're from, let's say, the University of the Philippines, then you can certainly do that. You just need an ETA. You can enter Canada. You can tell the border officer that you're in Canada for 1 semester, for 1 semester for 4 months, and you can study in Canada while doing so. I will note, however, that normally, if you have a study permit and you're pursuing a program that leads to a degree, diploma, or a certificate, and it's at least for one academic year, typically you're allowed to work for up to 20 hours a week. Uh, during the academic term. But if you're on an ETA or a TRV for that matter, and you don't have a study permit, that privilege doesn't necessarily, is not necessarily given to you.
Ah, no, I didn't know that. That's brand new info. And if ever, because some people might see this as a loophole, right? If you're only
Mhm.
if you're an ETA and you're able to study in Canada for like less than 6 months, could this be a pathway to permanent residency? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the problem with that is that in theory, sure, it could open up possibilities for you to find a way to stay in Canada on a permanent basis. Let's say, for example, you're doing a semester's exchange in Canada and you find an employer who's willing to, in that situation, you entered Canada with an ETA because you don't need a study permit. So it's easier, obviously. And then while you're in Canada, you're able to find an employer who's willing to sponsor, for example, an LMIA to support a work permit application. So in theory, you can still make an application for work permit and have it treated as if you're outside Canada. So essentially, just another visa office will process it while you're still in Canada. Doing your exchange in a particular university, for example. So that's one scenario where it's possible. So the thing about ETAs and pathways to permanent residency is it's not a formalized pathway to permanent residence. And quite frankly, studying in Canada is not a formal pathway to permanent residence. So that's why, a lot of international students unfortunately suffer if they don't plan properly for a PR pathway or strategize properly when they enter as students in Canada. So I would be very cautious about using this particular route. It's not impossible, but there are a lot of challenges that come with it.
Yeah, for sure. And again, for those who are interested in actually getting their student visas and not the ETA way or want to immigrate to Canada, we've actually partnered up with Lou and his team at LJD Law to give you a special discount for consultations. So just click the link in the description below to get 100 off your first consultation. But yeah, moving on. Um, Lou, can someone apply for an ETA even if they've been previously denied a visa to Canada?
So it doesn't matter if you've been refused a visa to Canada in the past, so long as you had a visa to Canada in the last 10 years. And so long, or in the other situation, so long as you have a valid US visa, you can try to make an application for an ETA. Now, in the normal situation where there are no hits to your name, for example, uh, applications would typically be approved in a matter of minutes, typically anywhere between 2 to 10 minutes, as experience dictates. But if you've been refused a visa, they're likely going to associate your name with your file in the system, and they're going to have a human person look into your file to make sure that they're approving an ETA and identifying if you're a risky traveler, meaning someone who would overstay in Canada, for example, would respect the rules while they're in Canada. And if they make a determination that they're not convinced, they may just refuse your ETA. What would be your remedy at that point? You can still make an application for an ETA, or I would say better yet, apply for a proper visa. And then in that situation, you're able to address the concerns of an officer if there are any. They usually would have to address it. They would have to say, oh, person breached the conditions of their permit in the past. Let's say it was like 7 years ago. I'm not convinced that they're going to leave Canada at the end of their authorized stay. In a TRV application post ETA refusal, then you could actually make your case. You can state your case and argue for your position that you're a different person, that you're stable, that you're established wherever you are, so that you can travel to Canada to visit friends.
Yeah. And since you mentioned overstaying, like what actually happens if someone overstays their ETA? Like I know it's a 5 year
Right.
validity. What happens if they want to stay for like okay, I'm saying for more than 5 years?
Okay, so let me clarify a few things about that because this is a true source of confusion. So an ETA is like a visa, but it's not a visa. It's like a visa that is valid for 5 years or up to the maximum of your passport, whichever is shorter. Okay. Um, so you have that. It's like a visa, so it allows you to travel to Canada. When you enter Canada, you're typically on each trip allowed to stay in Canada for up to 6 months. Uh, just like in the US, for example, it's 6 months when you enter on a B1, B2. But in Canada, the difference is it's up to 6 months, meaning an officer can actually tell you and mark it on your passport that, okay, I'm letting you in, but I'm only allowing you to stay for 2 weeks. But the maximum is 6 months. If you're staying for more than 6 months, you need to apply for what's called a visitor record. Visitor records are something that you can apply for at the port of entry, typically, if you're a child accompanying an international student, for example, or if you're in Canada and you're already there in your fifth month, you need to stay an extra month, for example. So you can make an application to immigration directly to get authorization to stay in Canada for another extra month. So yeah, so what happens to go back to your question? What happens if you overstay, let's say, the 6 months that were given to you? Well, then you would be what's called in violation or in contravention of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which means that you're in non-compliance. And if someone writes you up for inadmissibility, then you get a 5 year ban from entering or traveling Canada. And you have to wait 5 years for that to lapse. And at that point, you have to make applications to enter Canada on whatever means you can, such as an ETA or a TRV. But at that point, you'll really have to explain that you won't do it again, what happened back then, and you need to make sure that you're able to convince the officer that it would never happen again.
Okay, y'all. If you're listening, basically, don't do it. Don't overstay to avoid
Yeah,
any problems in the future.
it's not
Uh,
for 5 year stay; it's for 6 months maximum, typically.
that is such a good clarification. I know there's a lot of confusion in that, so thanks, Lou. Well, I'm curious, why was this launched in the first place? Because we are already experiencing backlogs in student visas, Canadian permanent resident citizenship applications. Why all of a sudden this got launched? What happened there? Any thoughts?
Well, two things. First is I think that that is precisely the reason why they're launching this. The Philippines is a high growth area for Canada in terms of tourism, travel, and people to people relationships. There are about 1 million Filipinos and people in Canada who have Filipino origin. And that means that there's going to be more contact between our two countries. So that means as well that there are a lot of visa applications for that are coming from the Philippines by putting forward this program that allows a certain set of people to come to Canada without a visa. That means a lot of visa officers won't be processing their TRVs. And that in the end will help the backlogs. So if you think about it from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense. It's very facilitative. Number two, and I'm spitballing here a bit. I will say that Canada is truly invested in its relationship with the Philippines. They know that it's a high growth area. They know that it's an important demographic inside Canada, that 1 million people in Canada have traced their roots to the Philippines. So Canada is, doubling down on its investment in not just in the Philippines, but it's in relationship and people to people relationships.
Mm, gotcha. And before we move on to the next topic, Lou, there are like two things that no one seems to talk about, and feel free to share your screen if you want. But these are, if your Canadian PR card has expired, can you apply for ETA? Or,
Mhm.
on the website, I saw that it's only
Yeah.
applicable for those who want to travel to Canada by air, and that's super specific. Can you talk more about those two things?
Yeah, for sure. And this one's a trickier one, Daniel. I'll give you that. And I'd like to show this website of the government of Canada. And I believe you're going to include a link of this in the description of this video. But this website allows you to, it's essentially a wizard tool. It allows you to answer certain questions when you think you would like to apply for an ETA. And it tells you whether you're eligible to apply for one. So let's run through this as if, say, for example, I'm a permanent resident, but my PR card is expired and I'm outside Canada. So, yeah, as you know, a lot of people and your viewers know, in order to travel to Canada, you must have a visa or an ETA, or if you're a permanent resident, you must have a permanent resident card. So let's simulate that for a bit. So let's say I'll click on passport here. So what travel document do you plan to use to travel to Canada? Passport. And let's hit next question. And then here we'll need to put in the country code. That's PHL for the Philippines. And then hit the next question. Let's say, are you a dual Canadian citizen? In this case, your fact pattern, Daniel, was permanent resident, expired card outside Canada. So I'll answer no for this one and then hit next question. The next question is, are you a lawful permanent resident of the United States? And do you have official proof of this, such as a green card? In your fact pattern, again, that's a no. You're a permanent resident in Canada, albeit with an expired PR card. And if I hit next question, then the next one would be, have you held a Canadian visitor visa in the past 10 years? Or do you currently hold a valid US non-immigrant visa? So let's just answer yes for that particular question. Because let's say you may be a permanent resident with an expired PR card outside, but let's say you were actually holding a visitor visa to Canada in the past, in the last 10 years. Let's hit next. And if I'm traveling via let's say car or airport by air, let's hit next. And it gets us to this question. What do you plan to do in Canada? Remember, you're a permanent resident. So if you were a permanent resident, the response would be a returning permanent resident, but it's not here. It's here for work, study, which you may do as a permanent resident, but this one's designed for foreign nationals who are not permanent residents. So truly, An ETA is not for permanent residents. So that's the short answer to the long explanation that I did. But I just wanted us to walk through this particular wizard as well to show you this powerful tool that IRCC has on the website, on their website, that allows you to determine if you can apply for an ETA. But essentially, here's the rule, Daniel. If you're a permanent resident and if you have an expired PR card and you've been outside Canada for a bit, what you need to travel back to Canada is what's called a permanent resident travel document or a PRTD. If you don't have that, unfortunately, sorry, if you haven't respected your residency obligation in Canada, meaning you have to be physically present in Canada for 2 years out of 5, then you may have problems when you apply for a PRTD. So in those situations, I would say assess your legal situation properly. Consult with a legal professional who is familiar with non-compliance, because in truth, you're actually already non-compliant with the rules. And under Section 28, I believe, of the or 27 of the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, a permanent resident of Canada has a right to enter and remain in Canada subject to the provisions of the Act. The condition is you must have met the conditions, such as having a permanent residence card. But Section 28 specifically says here, you must comply with the residency obligation with respect to every 5-year period, meaning you have to be in Canada physically for 2 years out of 5. If you didn't, then that gives the government of Canada the right to revoke your permanent residence. So if you've been away from Canada for longer than that, your PR is technically not revoked yet, despite your PR card being expired already. But you'll need to apply for a PRTD. And in that process, that's typically where a Canadian official would actually make a determination that you didn't meet this obligation under Section 28 and that they could revoke your permanent residence at that point. They'll send you notice. So before you do that, if you think that you may not have respected your residency obligations, because there are exceptions to this rule, please contact a legal professional if you need help. Don't hesitate.
Hmm. So interesting. And then one other specific thing is, I know we went through this wizard earlier, but if you're traveling to Canada by like land, like I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
land or sea, it's basically not gonna work, right? It has to be
Yep.
via an airplane.
Yeah, so you're right. So that is one of your questions. So I would refer back to this tool. Let's quickly go through it again. So let's do Philippines. And if you're a dual citizen, you're not a green card holder, and you held a Canadian visa, or if you have a valid US visa, and if you travel to Canada by car, train, bus, or boat, if I select that and I hit next question and I'm saying tourism, it says that you need a visitor visa. If I had hit air, for example, let's have a look at what happens if I hit air. So let's do the same fact pattern, PHL. Here we go. And you're not a dual citizen of Canada, not a green card holder. And let's answer yes to this question. And let's hit air through a Canadian airport. And let's say visiting as a tourist, you're eligible to apply for an ETA. So this wizard is very useful. And I'm glad that you're sharing this link in this video so people can use it.
Yeah, like that's super specific. That's so interesting. And again, to access this link, just check the description in this video. All right, Lou, thank you for that. And now we're moving on to the next topic, which is something very exciting and something that could help a lot of people. It's about the expansion of the Express Entry Program. Lou, can you
Mm-hmm.
talk more about? I'm checking the website right now. Okay, talk more about the Express Entry rounds of invitations, which is
For sure.
category based selection.
Yeah, so I believe you're referring to this particular website, and the link is also available in the description of this video. I
Exactly.
believe you mentioned that earlier.
Hmm.
So not too long ago, I believe about almost 2 weeks ago now, Minister Fraser had an announcement. But the truth is, they've been announcing this for quite some time. It's been in the works for too long, in my opinion. But they finally made the announcement. They pulled the trigger. It was supposed to be launched in January. They've delayed it for approximately 6 months, but now we're finally here. So it's called express entry rounds of invitations, category-based selection. So, just to step back a little bit to see the big picture, as a lot of your viewers probably already know, Express Entry is Canada's intake system for permanent residence applications. And under Express Entry, you have several programs such as the Federal Skilled Worker Program. You also have the Canadian Experience Class, and you also have the Federal Skilled Trades Program. And then on top of it, you have some permanent provincial nomination programs who piggyback on the Express Entry platform so that they can make nominations from those who are already in the pool. They're adding something else to this because if you're following Express Entry closely, as you know, the cutoff score to receive an invitation to apply so that you can apply for permanent residence has trended on the higher end of this, the scale. So per my last recollection, the last draw was 486 as a cutoff score. And to give you an idea of a typical profile from the Philippines, let's say someone who graduated from the University of the Philippines who is under 30 years old. So let's say this one is 27 years old, has a solid skilled work experience of 3 years. Let's say they take the English test and they're 10 out of 10. They don't speak French. That person is probably going to top off at about 445 points with a comprehensive ranking system. So if you look at that score, 445 versus the trends in the last few months for express entry cutoffs, the scores have been very high. They're ranging anywhere between 484 to 500 plus. But lately, it's kind of like stabilized somewhere within 480s range and in that particular range. And I don't really see it going down very soon. And the reason for that is there's a lot of people who have bonus points who are in Canada, who are continuously working on expanding and increasing their points through more experience inside Canada, which they make them eligible for the Canadian Experience Class, quite frankly, which is a program under Express Entry, as I earlier mentioned. But all that to say is that if you're in, let's say, the Philippines and you're trying to immigrate directly through express entry, it's very difficult under the general draws in the current program as it is now. However, as I said in the last announcement, basically what you're going to see is rounds of invitations where they're going to do category-based selection. And if you go to this website, I would encourage you to do so and read it very carefully. You'll see that they have identified 6 categories for 2023. And it's very important because this is a list where you can check if your occupation in the last 3 years, if it's included. So let's go through it very quickly. One is if you have French language proficiency. So if you're not only great in English, but also if you have a good handle on French, then that's great. It makes you eligible. It's not really occupation specific, but it's a category. So whatever your job is, if you're a francophone, great, you can apply for it. Next would be healthcare occupations. I think this has been in the news. We've had shortages of healthcare workers, so no surprise there. Third would be STEM occupations. Fourth, trade occupations. Fifth, transport occupations. Sixth, agriculture and agri-food occupations. So before I, ask you to ask me questions, just very quickly, I'll note this. This same website has a bunch of radio buttons here for each of these occupations. And I would encourage you again to open them by clicking them. And you'll see that these categories will pop open a table. And let's expand this one on healthcare, for example. And there are 35 occupations under this particular category, which would include chiropractors, dentists, dietitians, registered nurses, physicians. You also have audiologists, nurse practitioners, optometrists. The list is long. So if you look closely on this eligibility instruction here, to be eligible, you must have accumulated in the past 3 years at least 6 months of continuous work experience in Canada, and this is important, or abroad. To me, what that means is that even if you're a direct applicant from outside Canada, you didn't study in Canada, but you'd like to see if you can immigrate to Canada, that means that if you're in the Philippines or somewhere in the Middle East and you satisfy these requirements, then there's a good chance that you could get selected at this point. of course, pending further instructions, right? And one more thing, Daniel, I'd like to look at this particular list. This is very interesting. Science, technology, engineering, and math. Um, so healthcare makes sense. As I said, Canada has a shortage. But for STEM workers, if you look at this, there are 24 categories, and some of them include very interesting professions or occupations, such as web designers, web developers and programmers, land surveyors, data analysts and data administrators, data scientists, cybersecurity specialists. So the list is pretty robust, in my opinion. There's a lot of people who consult with me on the regular, and a lot of them, previously I would have told them your chances are not very good. You could probably look at provincial nomination programs, or you may want to study in Canada to increase your points. But now, because of this program, I could tell them, oh, you fall in one of the occupations. We can do a direct application when they do a draw. So that's huge. That's a lot of money saved. That's a lot of having to crisis manage your life in the next 5 years if you come into Canada on two steps. First as a student, then hopefully making it as a permanent resident.
That is huge. Lou, before we wind down this interview, we have a few minutes left. There are a lot. I think this is huge, especially for, again, as you said, the healthcare industry. What does this mean for basically nurses or doctors? Like, how easy would it now be for them to move to Canada? I know there's a whole they have before this came in, they need to get a license in Canada or something. Can you
Sure.
talk more about how much easier it is now for like nurses or those in the healthcare industry
Right.
to move to Canada?
So before I dive into that, and as I will say, the devil's always in the details. Um, I will say this, that the licensing process, if you're not a licensed physician or a licensed nurse in Canada, in whichever province that is, that's a completely different issue with respect to immigration. But if you worked as a physician, say for example in the Philippines, or as a registered nurse in the Philippines, and you satisfy the requirements for healthcare here, as mentioned, past 3 years, 6 months of continued work experience, then you can apply directly under the Express Entry program and see if you get an invitation when you set up your profile. And if you get invited, you can apply for permanent residency directly without having to worry about competition from people who have like 500 points for CRS. So remember that typical UP grad that I said, who's at 27, has at least 3 years of experience as a nurse, for example, and has 10 out of 10 for English. Score is 445, for example. Even if that score is actually substantially low than someone who's got work experience in Canada, they stand to have a chance in the fight to obtain an invitation to apply for permanent residence. So that's great. And then when they become permanent residents in Canada, they can work on their licensing process and then as far as I understand the news with that, um, certain provinces such as Ontario, they're starting to kind of like look into the difficulties and the roadblocks for foreign trained nurses to basically get their credentials, accepted in Ontario so that they can work in their profession when they come to Canada as permanent residents.
That is huge. That is really great news. And again, Lou, you've tackled really great details here, but I'm sure a lot of our viewers want to know more. If they want to get in touch with you, what would be the best way to do it?
So the best way is to book a consultation with us. You can do so, and you can do so through our website, but through Daniel and Bea, you can, and if you watch this video, you can use the link that's provided in this video, which will give you a discount when you book a consultation. Normally, we charge 300 Canadian dollars for consultations, but if you click this special link, basically you'll get $100 off that, so you're only paying $200 instead of the usual 300. And this link shouldn't expire anytime soon. I believe we put another 100 into it. So, first come, first serve, obviously. Hopefully you can make the line. And we can talk about anything, really. If you've been refused for a study permit and you want to see what your chances are for reapplication, we also have some tools in our toolkit to essentially help people who've been refused multiple times. We've helped someone recently who was refused 3 times for a study permit to turn it around, and now they're in Canada. And fun story, international student spouse is a dentist in the Philippines. And look at this list that I just showed you. It includes dentists under healthcare. So they're just in their first year in Canada, but it sounds like, or at least by this announcement, it looks like they're going to become permanent residents if I can help it. Hopefully, they'll be permanent residents very soon.
That is absolutely fantastic. And again, guys, we don't get just any sponsor in our videos. We vouch by Lou and his team. Again, they helped us become permanent residents in just under 2 years, just because of certain programs opening. And this might be another great way for you to become a permanent resident, especially if you're in these fields that Lou just shared. Lou, once again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for giving us so much value, and looking forward to the next updates.
Likewise. Thanks, Daniel, for having me.
Thanks, Lou. See you next time. Bye.
Take care.